Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. This webinar is being hosted by the Office of Sustainability at Lakehead University. And my name is Lita McKellar. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the university. This is part one of our webinar series, Sustainability Across the Disciplines, which is a series of presentations that explore sustainability as discussed by various faculty members across the disciplines at Lakehead. And it ranges from topics such as how sustainable behavior is impacted by our psychological orientation to the marketplace, to how digital tools and an increasingly online presence can impact human and planetary well-being. And so this series is really about exploring some of the bigger picture challenges to embracing a sustainable future. Tonight's webinar, as I'm sure is on the screen actually, is entitled The Parking Lot as Nature, How Our Dependency on the Marketplace Leads Us to View Nature as Separate and Why This Matters. And it will be given by Dr. Mirella Stroink, who's with us today. Dr. Mirella Stroink is a professor of community and environmental psychology and chair of the Department of Psychology at Lakehead University. Her research is rooted in the application of complex adaptive systems theory to understanding human cognition and behavior in the ecological and social context. Specific areas of research include the psychology of systems thinking, psychological resilience in interaction with social and ecological processes, and the adaptiveness of environmental, food, and consumer behavior. Dr. Stroink earned her PhD in social psychology from York University in 2005. I just wanted to say that the impetus for this presentation actually began 4 or 5 years ago when I just started the position of sustainability coordinator, and I interviewed various faculty conducting sustainability related research, and Mirella was one of them. And I found the conversation with her so fascinating because she really looked at the bigger picture of sustainability and its barriers. And when I first started working in this position, I noticed how easy it is for some people, including myself sometimes, to get lost in the little details and complexities of sustainability, like the contradictions in recycling or weighing what an item is made out of versus where it was made. But I think embracing a sustainable future requires a cultural shift, which is just as much about our collective worldview and connecting those dots as it is about those little actions that we may or may not take. So Mirella was really opening my eyes to how critical it is that as individual people, we understand our interconnectedness. So I'm really excited that years later, we're having this conversation with all of you. And then before I start, I just wanted to do a couple quick housekeeping things. So we are recording this webinar because we may put it on the website later at the Lakehead's website. And we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. And so we ask that unless you have a burning question that's best addressed during the presentation, that you wait until the end at the question period. And if you have questions or when you have questions, please use either the raise hand function, and you can use your audio to ask a question, or you can also use the Q&A box if you like, which is usually at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and we'll be sure to call on you. So please use the chat box for comments or technical issues if you have any, and try to keep your questions at the end relevant to the discussion discussed tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mirella. Thank you.
Thank you, Lita, and thank you to the Office of Sustainability for organizing this series. As Lita mentioned, I hadn't realized it was that long ago, but I thought it was more like 2 or 3 years ago, but I think you're right. 5 years ago, we had this conversation, and I hope to be able to get at some of that today around the idea of that larger cultural shift that is required to really get to where we need to be. So thank you all also for signing on tonight. I know there's pros and cons to the webinar version. I usually enjoy the kinds of conversations you might have had under different circumstances. If we'd been in the study, I could have seen all of you and interacted with you and asked questions. But this has its advantages too, and we'll make the most of it for sure. So indeed, I'm a professor and chair here in the Department of Psychology at Lakehead University, but I wasn't always that. I actually grew up in the Toronto area. My parents were immigrants from the Netherlands, and they built a business through the 1980s. And one day I went with them to what felt like the very edge of the city, up some road deep into a farmer's field, where my parents were excitedly mapping out their piece of that urban industrial sprawl that would soon pave over all of those farmers' fields and become that area of Mississauga that you fly over when you go into Pearson Airport now. And at that time, though, I remember walking through these muddy, snowy fields following animal tracks and feeling sad over what felt like the progressively looming displacement of humanity over the habitats of all of these animals that I could see evidence of. I guess I was rebellious in my own way. That's me there on the roof of their business. And that was near Highway 10 in Mississauga at the time in the 1980s. And it looks quite a bit different now. But anyways, I left Toronto, returned to Toronto, and trained in social psychology. With my PhD in hand, I ultimately arrived here at Lakehead, eager to apply my knowledge of how people think about themselves and others. That's what social psychology is about, to understand our collective destruction of the environment. I was always concerned about that since I was young. So I wanted to use those tools of social psychology and then environmental psychology to really get a handle on what are the psychological factors that go into explaining our environmentally destructive behavior. It turns out that at that time, 15 years ago, I knew very little. And I hope to share with you today some of what I've been thinking about for the last 15 years. And maybe Lita and I will do another presentation like this in another 15 years and I'll actually have more answers. You never know. So my goals for the presentation today are to challenge, first of all, my main goal is to challenge your understanding of what nature is, to critically question, what do you think nature actually is? And through that challenge, I hope to explore a bit about our psychological interactions with our total environment and end up in a place where we can consider how psychological and cognitive or mental factors might explain some of our environmentally damaging decisions and behavior. So let's start with that first question then. What is nature? So I would probably, if we were in a room, I'd look at all of you and try to see if anybody had an answer. But here are some expressions that might try to give you some perspective. It's where we go when we need to get away from it all. It's where we go back to when it all gets to be too much. And when we have spent a week camping and find ourselves a little smelly, we lament that it is time to get back to reality. So from these statements and many others like them, it appears that nature is somewhere away from all the things that we normally deal with. So it's somewhere away from where we usually are. It's somewhere behind us, and it's not what we consider reality. So where is nature located then? So it's all of these things. Where actually is it? Well, typically we consider it to be in places where there are no people or few people, like this is a Quetico Provincial Park. So you might think, oh, that's nature. It's beautiful. There's no people there. And that's what nature is. Is that the case? Are there no people in nature? So I've taken some, I put together a few pictures of animal habitats in nature I thought I'd share with you. So again, if we were together, I'd look around and I'd say, okay, here's a picture of a beaver dam and a waterway, and I'd look around, is this nature? So some enterprising beavers have moved some sticks and mud into a waterway to control the habitat and increase their access to food and shelter. So is that nature? Usually I see people nodding, where's this going? And then I would show a picture like this and I would say, well, here's a squirrel's nest on the top and a bird's nest on the bottom. And again, these animals have moved mud and sticks or branches around to try to create habitats for themselves, shelter from the elements for themselves and their young. Is this nature? Yes, yes, this is nature. And then I show this and I say, here's a human habitat. The human beings have moved fancy sticks and mud into their habitat to create dwellings to protect themselves and their offspring from the elements and to control their access to food. Wait, you said. Now I start to look around and I see confused looks and head shaking. This isn't nature. right? If I ask, is this nature? I usually get those looks and people are not so sure. Where is she going? This professor is crazy. This is not nature. This is everything that is opposite to nature that I don't like about urban sprawl. It's the suburban subdivisions. But really, why is it not nature? In all three pictures, you had animals using mud and sticks to alter their habitats to support their needs for survival, for food, and for shelter. Bricks and 2x4s are just really fancy mud and sticks. So why do we not consider human habitats to be nature? Why do we look at this and say, well, yeah, but that's not nature. This is the opposite of nature. So why do we not consider these things to be nature? Well, ultimately, it's because we consider ourselves to be different, to be separate from nature. There is our space over here in our towns and cities, and then there is nature's space out there in Quetico Provincial Park and other places like that where there are no people. Fundamentally, we do not consider ourselves to be a species of animal interacting with its landscape, building habitats, gathering food. Even when we engage in all of those same behaviors as other animals, we see ourselves as being different. Now, I'm not the first to explore this as a fundamental philosophical question. There have been other people who've written about that. And I realize that ultimately you might say, okay, well, you're just playing with language. This is semantics. In English, we define nature as being non-human. So maybe there is it is a semantic question, but that's still important. So our linguistic and social conventions both reflect and shape our understanding of who we are. They shape our psychological interactions with our environment. Those linguistic conventions, those social conventions, how we construct words like nature and that meaning, that shapes how we see ourselves. It shapes how we see our environment and the interaction between ourselves and our environment. So it matters, even if it's a linguistic convention. So when you are in the Walmart parking lot the next time you are there, ready to go and forage for some food, you look around and you engage with words and symbols representing the human constructed social economic world. What you do not see, but it is certainly there, is the water table under your feet, the organic earth under your feet, the species of plant pushing their way through to the sun, through the cracks in the pavement, the other animals around you, both of your own species and of other species, and all the earthly origins of the food and other consumer goods that you are considering all around you. So you see and interact with largely the social and economic meanings of the world around you. We tend to only see the social and the economic when we're out in the world. We don't tend to notice all of the biophysical environmental aspects of the world that we're around. So to what end, I ask, why does this matter? So what does this do to our psychological interactions with our total environment? What does this tendency to separate ourselves from that biophysical environment, to not see it when we're out in our world, what does that do to how we psychologically interact with our world? How does that impact our choices, particularly at this time when the consequences of our choices are becoming increasingly evident? So that brings me to kind of the meat of this presentation today. So the total human environment. I actually really like this meme. I don't usually like memes, but this one I like. Things are not always what they seem. The deer isn't crossing the road is crossing the forest. I don't know if any of you have heard of a figure ground image. We use those in sensation and perception in psychology. It's you may have seen where it looks like there's a vase, a white vase in the middle of the picture, and then two faces that are black side by side. So you can only see, you see either the faces or the vase in the middle. And you can shift your perception. You can see the two faces or you can see the vase, and then you flip back and forth between seeing them, but you can't see both at the same time usually. I like to do that with this meme, where I flip back and forth from seeing the deer crossing the road, and then I can flip it around and seeing the road crossing the forest. And I like this because that is what I'm trying to get at, is your tendency or your ability to flip back and forth between seeing things being sort of social and economic centric first versus environmental centric first. Anyway, so that's just a sort of a prelude to where I'm going. So in order to understand how people interact psychologically with the environment and how this results in potentially destructive behavior, there are two related conceptual issues I have to deal with first. And the first is this question of how to describe the human environment in a way that doesn't separate the human from the nature. And that's harder than you might think. Talking about humans' impacts on the environment, you're already talking about two things that are separate and one is affecting the other. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find a way to talk about them as being one and the same thing. So I've struggled with this, and ultimately I found some answers in complexity theory, which I'm going to come back to, but only very briefly in a moment. We need to consider the psychological person in the context of their total environment. And I have been calling this the total human environment, and there are some other scholars that do that too. And that is the full context in which people survive and adapt. It includes the social economic environment and the biophysical environment, and these are tightly coupled. So the social economic and the biophysical environments, they're tightly interconnected. So there's been various researchers who've talked about this interdependence in a number of ways. So for example, Ostrom and others have talked about ecodiversity. Maklis refers to the human ecosystem. There's a large literature on what's called coupled human and natural systems. And ecosystem services literature looks at the economic benefits of ecological services, so like watershed and so on, how that impacts humans at an economic level. And then social ecological systems literature and the natural resources management tries to link social processes and economic processes to ecological systems. With all of these different literatures and approaches to this question of the total human environment, fundamental to all of these literatures is the recognition that ecological processes, human processes from communities, economies, farms, waterways, forests, all of that are all comprised of systems. So it comes down to being able to talk about systems and seeing how social systems are interdependent with ecological systems. So I have found that in order to adequately understand and talk about that total human environment, we need to be able to talk about dynamic, nonlinear systems. And now I'm sure your minds are going, no, please don't. So this exercise took me into the depths of complex adaptive systems theory, which isn't even itself one thing, but actually many different things, all of which are mostly beyond the scope of this talk. So I'll just say in short that a complex adaptive system is a system or a network of many individual agents or components, so different parts, each of which is independent to do what it would like, but it's also interdependent in a network so that the actions of any one agent impacts all the other agents, who in turn have to change their behavior because of those actions, and those changes change the context for the original agent, who again has to adapt to that new context by changing its behavior. So you see back and forth through those interdependencies, the system as a whole produces what's called emergent outcomes or patterns that you can see on the level of the entire system, but you can't have anticipated from the behavior of the individual agents in the system. So one of the most exciting aspects of complex adaptive systems theory is its description of naturally occurring processes and principles that can be observed in and actually link human systems with those of the rest of nature. That's why I love using complex adaptive systems theory, because the principles and processes that it describes are the same whether you're talking about the brain or you're talking about an organization or a community or an economy or an ecosystem. I'm glossing over a number of differences, of course, but fundamentally it is the same set of principles. All of those naturally occurring systems follow the same fundamental principles that can be described by the various theories that I'm lumping together under the term complex adaptive systems theory. So by way of example, systems created by the interactions of people, such as the economy or the internet or organizations of people, communities or organizations, show the same system properties as biological and ecological systems. So on your left, you have an economic system That is actually the network of interactions created by users who use Bitcoin, interacting with each other. In the middle, you have the internet, which is a network of networks. Each of those dots is a device or a computer interacting with other devices and computers, creating systems of interaction. And on the far right, you have an example of an organization or a set of organizations, in this case, international aid organizations, and how they cite or reference each other in their activities. So in each of those cases, so on the right, for example, each organization in an international aid context is an agent interacting with other agents and changing their behavior, doing things, acting, which now makes other organizations have to change or adapt to those changes, which creates a system or a network of organizations that collectively have an impact on the global stage through their systems properties or their systems actions. So we move as humans, we move and interact following the same principles as other natural systems through our economic interactions, our digital interactions, and our organizational behaviors. And in those ways, we are the same as naturally occurring, see, I used the word naturally wrong there, of naturally occurring systems like biological systems like the brain or other biological systems in the body, as well as ecological systems. And the picture on the bottom is the food web of a spruce beetle. So you can see the species of animal interacting with each other within a forest environment also creates an emergent network or emergent system of patterns of outcomes that you can see across the whole forest. So even technical and infrastructure systems that are fully created by people, not by their interactions with each other, the way that economies and internets are, but they're created by people with intention in a planned way, like, for example, mechanical systems, transportation systems, or energy systems. These are also systems, and they follow some of the same principles. These systems are studied by systems engineers and are not usually dynamic or nonlinear. So they use slightly different theories and language in that field of systems engineering. But even these can take on dynamic aspects when they're in interaction with people. It's the people in interaction with mechanical or technical systems that create the unexpected, the nonlinear outcomes that befuddle the systems engineers. People are not mechanical. We are animals of the one organic planet following the same principles, observable and complex adaptive systems throughout all living systems. So hopefully that wasn't too deep into complex systems theory for you. Trust me, I can go a lot further. If there are any students out there, you know. So people are themselves agents within numerous systems. You are an agent within your family system, within your workplace system, or your small groups, outward to your communities. Every time you engage with the economy or the marketplace, you are an agent in an economy. Your computer and you through it are an agent in the internet. But you're also part of an ecosystem of plants, trees, and other animal species. Every time you acquire food, you are interacting with those ecological systems as well, even through mediation with through systems, the food system. So therefore, if we are trying to understand that total human environment as inclusive of both biophysical environments and the social, economic, technical environment, in the recognition that these operate according to similar principles, then complex systems theory might be useful in trying to frame those thoughts. And that's what I've been trying to do. Nevertheless, what is evident is that people try to adapt and survive and live their lives within nested layers of systems. And these systems are all interdependent with each other. By way of example, social systems, those patterns that emerge and become structured through our interactions with each other among people over time, produce things like social inequalities and differences in position and power. Those emerge through processes of social interaction and the dynamics of systems. Those social systems of power interact with ecological systems, producing effects like environmental racism, as well as the very different experiences that people have of the food system, depending on their social position or level of power. So you can see the interactions among social systems and ecological systems across all of those different levels. So that's one of the conceptual issues I've kind of had to wrestle with. But there's another one, and this is where things heat up a bit for me. So the second conceptual issue to address as we try to understand how people interact psychologically with their total environment is, how do we understand the embedded interactions of psychological processes or mental processes within this total environment? Where is the mind in all of these social and ecological systems? Theorists in social ecological systems theory, for example, they talk about mental models, but they never go further than that. They treat people as being kind of the lowest point. They look at communities and upward to the climate. They don't go down below into the minds of people. And that's what I've been trying to do. So our greatest adaptive strengths as a species include our complex brains and our complex social orders. And interestingly, our brains and our need to communicate and coordinate our actions with each other in ever larger social groups co-evolved in something of a brain social world arms race. People interact psychologically, including cognitively and mentally, with their total environment. We extract meaning, we reproduce meaning through socialization and language and talking to each other, all in the service of social coordination. We try to coordinate our actions in the pursuit of survival and adaptation to our environment. Those have been our strengths as a species. This extraction and reproduction of meaning or thought is a social cognitive process, and it's studied by social psychologists, particularly in its subfield of social cognition. People's perceptions and construals, which means interpretations of the self and others, the dynamics of group identity. I identify with this group, you identify with that group, and what that creates. And the formation of what we call implicit theories. The word implicit means non-conscious, so theories and assumptions that I hold unconsciously. All of those are examples of topics that could play a role in understanding people's interactions with the total environment. So all of these things in social cognition could help us to understand how people are thinking about themselves in the context of that total human environment. So do these processes of social cognition operate according to the principles of complex adaptive systems theory? Now you know where I'm going. Maybe this still needs to be tested and further developed and explored, but to some degree, yes. Complex, nonlinear, and dynamic systems theories are actively involved in the subfields of psychology known as cognitive science, which actually is beyond psychology, but includes psychology, and neuroscience, same thing. So there are researchers who use complex systems theory. They typically call them nonlinear or dynamic systems theories in those fields. It's not as much present in social cognition yet, but it is getting there. The reason for that is methodological, and we can talk about that in questions if you wanted to. To this end, I've been trying to develop a conceptual framework rooted in complex adaptive systems theory that expands what we know about how social and ecological systems interact to include psychological systems. I'm trying to create a psychosocial ecological systems theory, if you will. I'm trying to bring that psychological level into how we talk about that total environment. So there have been 3 lines of research that I've been doing trying to get at this. One is systems thinking, which is an individual difference dimension that reflects how people see phenomena as systems or not. Psychosocial ecological resilience. For example, we just published this study looking at, or it's a conceptual paper, looking at how self-rated psychological resilience, so how resilient do you see yourself as an individual, is related to how resilient people perceive their surrounding systems to be. So that idea that my own resilience is interconnected with the resilience of the systems that sustain my survival, and that we can measure that on the individual level is another area of research I'm doing. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about this last one because it most directly relates to this question of sustainability. So it brings us back to our goal for today in terms of questioning our understanding of nature. So implicit ecosystem, which environment matters most? And again, I've here polarized the two environments, social, economic, and ecological, and I wish I didn't have to do that. But nevertheless, if you're looking at a social, economic environment, an ecological or biophysical environment, which one does a person orient more toward for their survival and adaptation? So people develop, adapt, survive. They're trying to live their lives as well as possible in a total environment that includes all of these systems that we've been talking about. As they do so, cognitive or mental networks of perception, meaning, and thought form or emerge and stabilize following the systems theory to support survival and adaptation in that total environment. So our mental models, our thoughts, support our survival in this total environment that we perceive as individuals. So researchers in the ecological sciences, as I said, they call this mental models. But with the tools of social cognition, we can dig a little bit more deeply into what those actually are. So some of those cognitive processes, like I said, are conscious, maybe attitudes. Many others are not. So we talk about non-conscious cognitive processes like implicit theories, as well as implicit cognitive factors underlying environmentally relevant behavior like implicit connection to nature. We have a sense of our connection to nature that we're not always conscious of. So one can think of these conscious and non-conscious cognitive processes that form through our interactions with our total environment as something of cognitive traces. They're like cognitive traces of a person's adaptation history in their total environment. It's like leaving like rings on a tree, or like well, traces, marks left behind in our thoughts of how we have adapted within a total environment. So maybe we can see the total environment of our adaptation in the thoughts of people. And if we can measure these, again, this is the way that I am a psychologist. I want to measure everything. If we can measure these cognitive traces of our adaptation in the total environment that we perceive, then we can get a sense of how they see that environment. Have they been adapting primarily to the economic environment or the biophysical environment, or both, and in what priorities? So for many people, the total environment includes both the biophysical environment and the social economic to varying degrees, and maybe it changes over time depending on where you are. For many of us though, the basic evolved process of trying to adapt and survive in an environment unfolds almost entirely in the human created systems of society and economy. For example, for most people, access to food and water are market-based and derive from interactions in the economy completely. The actual biological roots of our food and water are many layers deeper than the grocery store, and not usually that salient to the typical consumer. So when you are at Metro or Walmart and you're shopping for your food, you're not seeing all the biological roots of all of those foods. You see a cellophane wrapped styrofoam tray with some slabs of very cleanly sliced meat on it. To you, that is food. And the connection between that and the actual roots of it are so long distant that it's not salient to you at all. Processes of socialization that in the past would have ensured that young people could grow or hunt and prepare food as part of a socially coordinated community system are now aimed at ensuring that young people can earn a living and purchase food as part of a massive socially coordinated economy. You can see the similarities there, but it just got so much larger. Importantly then, these cognitive processes that support our survival, those cognitive traces I was talking about, now might be primarily or even entirely reflecting our social economic environment as opposed to the biophysical environment. Now, we are not all the same in this. So as individuals differ in how much they cognitively have adapted to the biophysical or the social economic environment, we can try to measure those differences. So we've been trying to measure individual differences and how much people orient to the biophysical or social economic environments for their survival. And to do this, we've created this survey measure called the competence scale. And it's an indirect way of measuring people's orientation to the biophysical and or the social economic environments. So people who complete this survey are asked to indicate how necessary each of a number of skills is to their success. Half of the skills are necessary for success in the social economic environment, such as earning money, and half in the biophysical environment, like growing your own food. We assume that people emphasize those skills that are relevant to the environment in which they see themselves mostly surviving and adapting, whether that's social, economic, or biophysical, or both. So once we created this survey, people respond to 14 items, you average their scores, and then you can do statistics correlating their scores on this competence measure with other measures to see what it relates to. And so I'll just show a couple of things. If you're not familiar with correlations, I'll just describe verbally what those mean. But what we've found using this survey is that most people assume that the more people assume their success hinges upon competence in the social economic environment, the stronger their materialistic values. So people who assume their survival depends on adaptation to the economy, they have higher materialistic values, as you'd expect, and they have less sense of connection to nature and lower beliefs and norms relating to environmental behavior. Likewise, the more people assume their success hinges on competence within the biophysical environment, the stronger their connection to nature and environmental attitudes, and the weaker their materialistic values. So these findings you would expect based on what that survey measures, and it makes sense. Furthermore, though, if you look at something that's like a behavioral outcome, policy support, the more people assume their success hinges upon competence in the social economic environment, the higher their support for policies that prioritize the economy or jobs over the environment, and the lower their support for policies that protect the environment at the expense of jobs. And assuming that success hinges on the social economic environment was also associated with being fearful of economic collapse, but not environmental collapse. Likewise, the more people assume their success hinges on competence in the biophysical environment, the higher their support for environmental policies, and the lower their support for economic policies, and the greater their fear of environmental collapse, but they didn't care as much about economic collapse. Where does this come from? Well, a couple things we considered. One was food behavior. So the more people assume their survival hinges upon success in the social economic environment, the less likely they are to get food directly from the farmer, and the less likely they are to grow their own food. But for those who think that their survival or their success hinges upon competence in the biophysical environment, are more likely to get food from farmer, fishing, hunting, forest products, and growing vegetables, and sharing food with their family, friends, and neighbors. Big grocery store didn't really work because essentially everybody uses it. But there was some relationships there too. And another place it might come from is childhood experiences. Basically, the more time you spend as a child, self-reported retrospectively, indoors and shopping, the more you think the social economic environment is important to your success, and your skills there are important to your success. And the more time you spent outdoors, the more you think the biophysical skills are important to your success. So what does all this mean? Well, these findings indicate that our interactions with our total environment, including the biophysical and social economic systems of our survival, they shape our thoughts, our cognitive systems of meaning, and these in turn direct our behavior. The fact that people prioritize the economy and jobs over the environment, that they would support policies that lead to greater climate change and pollution if it means more jobs, that is logical. It makes sense when you recognize that these people see the economy as being their environment of survival. They're trying to adapt to their environment. That's what they think their environment is. This in turn is possible because we do not see the interdependencies of all human systems and ecological systems. Our predominantly social economic driven survival behavior produces a mental model that excludes the biophysical environment, that supports the false perceptions that these are disconnected systems, and the perpetuation of environmentally destructive behavior. Phew, that's big stuff. Anyway, this all takes us back to the main question of this presentation. What is the environment? What is nature? What is the impact of how we in English, capitalist, Western philosophically rooted societies conceptualize humanity. I argue that by decoupling our survival from the biophysical environment, we decouple our minds from the biophysical environment. By decoupling our minds from the biophysical environment, we can see our environmentally destructive behavior as logical, or at least perhaps as an unfortunate side effect of the pursuit of survival. So what can we do with this? I'm not entirely sure, but maybe by finding ways to shift people's perceptions of their total environment, maybe increasing the salience of the biophysical environment in their day-to-day life, helping them to recognize and mark the interdependence of economic and ecological systems, maybe in food acquisition, if people could see how those are connected, maybe we could shift decision-making and behavior. And this is a long-range hope, perhaps. But it comes back to that question of cultural worldview that Lita started us off with. And I think that's where the shift needs to occur. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you for listening, if you're still there.
Thank you so much, Mirella. That was great. So much to think about. I'm not sure about everyone else, but I have a million questions. Yeah, that was really informative. So I encourage people to use the raise hand function, or you can use the Q&A too if you want, if you have a question. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, I know we said 7:45 end time, and that's coming up soon. So I had predicted this might happen. And Mirella had graciously offered to stick around for another 15 minutes. So I understand if you have to go. I'm honored that you're even here. There's a lot of competition for people's attention right now on the virtual web. But if you want to stick around and ask some questions, we're happy to have them. So Mirella, I'm thinking about, I'm still trying to process everything you said, but I'm thinking about what you mentioned around coupled human and natural ecosystems and the importance of decoupling, and in terms of sustainability and embracing a sustainable future, the importance of people sort of perhaps recognizing our economy as a human construct that doesn't live independently from the biophysical or from nature. And how do we get, I think you sort of started touching on it at the end, but how do we get people to recognize those connections and to start engaging in systems thinking? Why is it important for people to engage in that? I think you sort of touched on that too. And then how do we get there, and how early do we need to start?
Yeah, those are pretty fundamental questions, and I wish I knew better. But you're right in mentioning systems thinking. That is one thing that I've thought about, that if people had a better understanding of the interdependencies of these systems, then maybe they would be less likely to separate those things, separate nature from human as much as we do. When and how do you begin teaching that? I don't know. I've been involved in some research trying to look at the where systems thinking comes from or how we learn it. And there's different thoughts out there. There's training programs that exist that show some success. There have been educational interventions with children and young people that have also seen some success, that try to build that capacity for systems thinking. And I think that does help. But the challenge is that in all other areas of our lives, that is the opposite of how things work. So you can teach kids in an environmental education program about these interdependencies, but then you tell them to go get a job and operate in an economy that is not that. And even the language that they're speaking is not that. But where do you start? I think that things like that are where we need to start pretty early on, but it really does permeate everything that we do. I even see it in environmental psychology. I challenge my textbooks sometimes because of how they talk about, they might touch on the interdependencies, but then they scale back and they're still talking about separations. So that's one thing. And I think there might be ways too, if we could be creative as a society to make it more salient, the interactions between your market-driven food behavior, for example, and the actual biological roots of that food. I don't know how, but maybe that's something we can play with down the road, or somebody can.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Lita.
Definitely. Lots to think about there. I have a lot more questions in my head, but I'm going to bring it to the audience. So I see a question from Charles. I don't see any hands raised, so I'm gonna read what Charles Levko is a coworker of ours is asking. He says, Towards the beginning of the presentation, you described the separation of nature as something that is part of human nature, but you also pointed to the impact of social, economic, political constructions of the civilization-nature divide when you showed the Walmart picture. This raises a question for me. Do you see differences in the separation of the social, ecological, and different cultural and political economic contexts today? What about historically? And if so, how does this approach account for these cultural, political, economic differences?
That's a fun and fascinating question. That brings me to something else I read about a long time ago, and in looking at the evolution of culture and cultural evolution and how cultures adapt and change over time in interaction with each other. Surprise, surprise, you can use a complexity lens to look at cultures too. It just doesn't stop. But yes, I do see that that there are cultural differences and historical differences. I don't think that our separation of nature and society is a part of human nature. Like, I don't think that's a human nature thing. I think that is deeply rooted in I'm not sure the correct way to describe it, but I see it, in the Enlightenment era philosophers. It started there, it accelerated into industrialization, but it was there before that too, and spread with kind of the Western worldview. It is different across cultures. I don't think it's there in every culture in the contemporary sense. And certainly, I know I'm no expert, but in indigenous cultures, it is not like this. There is more recognition of the interdependence of humanity with our natural environment there. So it's certainly not, it's not part of human nature, and it has formed and been influenced by larger movements like industrialization and Western philosophical thought. But that's well beyond my expertise too. Oh, Lita, you're muted.
Sorry, classic.
I
I was
know.
also wondering about that, and how Indigenous worldviews could provide insight on becoming more interdependent in the way we're thinking, and not decoupling so much. So thank you for that question, Charles. Anita Valancourt, I'm sorry if I'm not entirely sure how to say your last name, says, oh, she's just wondering if the recording will be available. So yes, if you look in the chat box, the links is there, sorry. Frank Wilson is asking, is there a time in one's life where the brain is less likely to change views, even if interactions are expanded to include the biophysical?
You're asking about sort of sensitive periods in development. And I'm reluctant to say that it can't be changed throughout developmental processes. I think you still can gain a better understanding of the interconnections with all things, but I think, let me sort of slow down and back up. I think in childhood, there are opportunities there to reveal the interconnectedness of human processes with natural processes. And I think we recognize that in like the environmental education literature tries to take advantage of those critical periods and connecting kids with their natural environment and showing them those interdependencies. But I don't think it's too late if you get to being an adult and you didn't grow up that way. I think it can be experienced at any point in life, and you can still develop that sense of that interconnectedness.
Great. I'm going to move to Paul Berger, who has a question, and he says, isn't it more the corporate capture of government that blocks policy change rather than some people's prioritization of jobs over environment? Or is it that people's orientations let them accept that corporate capture and the resulting destruction?
Lets them accept that corporate capture. Yes, so that's an interesting question. And my mind runs to how government is an example of a structure that forms within the context of complex systems as people adapt and interact with each other. We form structures of government to organize our behavior collectively, and those structures become ever more deeply entrenched, and then can ultimately come to have a huge role in shaping, it's like backward shaping of people's behavior. So we can only do, as we move and interact within the world, we are shaped by the infrastructure that's laid out by government policies. And that limits to some degree what we're able to do as we interact in that space. So I would say it's both. I wouldn't say it's more government that blocks policy change. I think government tries to kind of walk lines between different stakeholders who have, representation from industry, who has powerful benefits from the status quo, and government tries to pander to that. And at the same time, they try to listen to people and youth demanding change. And so what you end up seeing is a lot of stuckness. So I don't know if, so people's orientations do allow them to accept that corporate or that government and corporate infrastructure, because that's been part of how that formed. It formed through interactions with those infrastructures and institutions, like through education and so on. I'm not really answering that clearly, but that's a very big question. And my mind is racing to a very far level. But yes, I would say both.
Charles, did that address your follow-up question there? You can chat.
Oh, I have to scroll down.
He had said, how much do people make these choices about the way they see the environment versus how much does the social, political, economic context control or contain that behavior? I think you started to get at that though.
Agency. Yes, that's another huge question. I had to address that as a result of reviewer too on a paper recently. Made me spend some time looking at the role of agency. So is it people's choice? When you're studying something on the psychological level and you say that it is it's a mental model, or it's a set of non-conscious assumptions people make that shapes their behavior, that doesn't mean they're choosing those behaviors. Those behaviors occur and form mental structures that support those behaviors and maintain them in interaction with an environment that includes institutions and government, education. So is it agency? I believe there is agency. People can choose. We are agents within a complex adaptive system. We are free to act independently. I can get up and dance on the tables in a meeting if I wanted to, but I know through mental processes, I can anticipate the consequences on my social network. And so I choose not to do that. So agency does occur within a complex adaptive system. But it's complex because it occurs within the infrastructure limitations provided by institutions and governments and other people. And so, yeah, but it's a fascinating back and forth.
Very fascinating. Barbara Barnett is wondering, what's the next study you're planning?
Thanks, Mackenzie. I know Mackenzie. What is the next study I'm planning? Well, it's hard to say. There's a number of different directions that we can go in. I've been doing a fair bit of work right now on that psychological resilience question, trying to understand how an individual's psychological resilience relates to their perceptions of the resilience of the systems that they're in. In terms of the implicit ecosystem construct, I have to do a fair bit of work on the measurement behind that. That competence scale needs some work. And so that has gotten a little bit dragged down into details, but there were questions that we were trying to work on. Like, I'm really interested in the connections between that implicit ecosystem and food behavior, and wondered even if you could, by having people interact with food of different types with different packaging, can you prime or momentarily activate a more biophysical ecosystem versus that marketplace or social economic ecosystem, just by virtue of the food that they interact with. So that was an idea that we'd had at one point too.
Perfect. Michel Bédard has a question for you, and he says, thank you, Dr. Stroink, for an excellent presentation. You touched on the concept of salience, particularly in relation to the production of food, but it may also apply to all of our day-to-day activities. We probably pay attention to large-scale destructive events, but otherwise not realize our impact. Drawing on your experience, can you imagine how we could increase salience for all of our actions and how we could test if we are successful?
Yeah, well, that gets at the heart of that idea that if we could increase the salience of the biophysical context of our social economic activities, maybe we could sort of start to change some of those cultural processes a little bit. How could we increase that salience? I've been trying to imagine that. And I think just by virtue of my other interest in food systems work, I think that's where I start, is looking at how we might even package food in such a way as to make it more salient where it's coming from, but not in a way that also, because, you know, one of the adaptations that the social economic infrastructure system has produced is in fact public health around food is not always a bad thing. But at the same time, if we can somehow make the origins of our food more salient in terms of their where they come from in the natural world, that might shorten the feedback loop or make people more aware that their own choices are impacting more than just the social economic environment. But yeah, that's a very challenging thing to try to imagine. But I think there's something that could be done there ultimately.
That's definitely something I'm going to think about more. Cheryl Loosely has a question. Can a complex adaptive approach to social psychology help explain big political shifts when people do choose new explanatory frameworks, political articulations, such as towards Trumpism and conspiracy theories? The support for Trump has led to one of the most significant gutting of environmental regulation in the past few decades.
Yes, that's very interesting. So I actually have been thinking about trying to understand the mindset that leads to support for Trump, but is also not just there, it's everywhere. And can we explain that through complex adaptive systems approach to social psychology? I can try, because yes, it does have impacts on environment. And what I would actually think, though I haven't tested this, is that people in that base who supported Trump, but really what they're, from what I've heard, are focusing on is, well, he promised jobs, right? All I want is a job, and all this other stuff that people talk about is confusing to me. I don't understand it, and it doesn't sound like what I value. I want jobs. And he said he would bring manufacturing back to the United States and this kind of thing. And he seems to have, to some degree, and at least initially, by destroying the environment. I think that reflects a complete, like 100% social economic implicit ecosystem. I think people who don't see the interconnections between their jobs and the environment that they live in, or they don't see the importance of that environment and its destruction to their own survival. I think that's what it's at the heart of that. It's like the opposite of systems thinking. I see only single causes. I don't see how large scale situations emerge from many factors. And I see only, I want my factory back in my town so that we can have a job. And I think that's just, it's like the opposite of systems thinking, and it's a completely social economic implicit ecosystem that results in that. It's like a completely different way of thinking that is very different from my own, but I'm trying to understand that, because I think, you know, even given the direction that the election obviously took, there's still a huge number of people who think that way. And I think it behooves all of us to understand that way of thinking and attempt to address it, and the things that lead to alienations that these people end up, voting in this direction, and ultimately leading to that mass destruction of the environment. Yes.
Perfect. You got some challenging questions, and you've done a really great
too.
job.
I could spend more time. What we need is like a glass of wine or a tea, and
Yeah,
like,
that's the after show.
yeah, if we could do that, that would have been much more fun.
Yeah. Well, we are at 8 o'clock. It went by really fast. So I guess we'll think about wrapping it up, even though I know I have a lot more questions for you. Even just thinking about language and how language plays into this, and the separation of nature and the economy. It really made me think of Robin Wall Kimmerer and her book Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about English and the word it, and how it sort of just objectifies nature. Like, it is how we refer to wolves and insects and rivers, and yet if we were to refer to our grandmother as it in English, that would be somewhat offensive and taking away her agency. So, and she talks in her book about Potawatomi and how 70% of Potawatomi is verbs, and there is no word it. Nature is sort of relational and referred to in relation. And what a different way, perhaps, of starting to think about the connection between the biophysical world and the social, economic, I forget all the terms that you put out, world. So that's something I'm going to think about a little bit more too. Yeah. So I don't know if you have any closing comments you wanted to say.
No, I was just going to say thank you, Lita, for organizing this. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that book, Braiding Sweetgrass, because I have it. And that very same paragraph on the verbs in the language stood out to me as well. So thanks for bringing that in.
Perfect.
Yeah. And thanks, everybody, for coming. It's been fun.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. And I really want to thank you, Mirella, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. It was really, really informative, and I look forward to reflecting on it more. So a round of virtual applause to to Dr. Stroink. And I also just wanted to stay tuned for part 2, which will be January 20th from 12 to 1. That's part of our series is entitled Indigenous Environmental Justice on the World Stage. Stories from the forgotten public hearings that made sustainable development a liberal pluralist approach to world cooperation. And that's going to be presented by Dr. Shara Loosely, who was with us today. And so I look forward to that. So thanks again so much to everyone. And on behalf of Lakehead University and our Office of Sustainability, have a good night.